Welcome to Coffee and Tea with Marquines. My name is Maria. For those who don't know us yet, stumbled upon maybe in the world of YouTube videos.
Who's this?
And this is the first real video in the new studio. We did one while the studio was kind of in construction, but this is the first time that we are doing a coffee and tea from Mark's studio. It's set up for the opening, so this video will be airing after the opening.
It's very live, the sound.
It is.
We need people
it
in
still
here.
resonates a little bit.
Yeah.
But today we wanted to talk a little bit about processes or the journey into abstraction, into abstract expression, right, of the world around, but also the world within. And I wanted to, as an artist, and by the way, the previous Coffee and Tea, if you, again, are new to this channel, Mark was showing his work, his 50 plus survey.
The development of my work over the years.
And you mentioned a little bit about that part of the journey, right?
Yes.
Moving from figurative into abstraction.
Touched on it.
Right. So, where do we begin? Figurative or what's the other name to call that kind of?
Well, you have, the terms are a little tricky.
Yes.
One way to put it is representational art or work versus non-representational. I've had discussions, Maria, with artists who we tend to agree that the whole term abstraction and non-representational work is a little tricky. Here's the thing, where to start. Let's begin with this idea that when we're making images as artists, if the image that we make is really recognizable, be it the figure or a landscape, still life, etc., then we say, oh, that's representational work. However, if the images that we're making are not that recognizable, we don't have a way to kind of hook onto what we're actually looking at, we tend to think of those images as abstract or non-representational. But there's a real blurry edge there. There's a lot of gray area there. One can make images that are figurative, pushing towards abstraction. Many examples historically of that. And vice versa. One can make abstract images that one can find connections, or a better word is associations. That's a key word, associations. So I think where I want to go with this conversation at the moment, here in the beginning, is how does an artist who has been working figuratively move towards abstraction? That's one aspect of a much larger conversation. Now, I've taught the processes of abstraction at the California College of Arts in San Francisco, where I used to teach. These were students, young mostly students, who wanted to really get into working abstractly, but wanted that journey to be authentic. Now, this is an important distinction. I say this because I feel like a great many artists are working abstractly, but they feel lost because there's no connection to why they're making these images. Perhaps they've seen other artists and they're emulating their work. Perhaps they just love to throw down paint and color and brushwork and have the playful time of it. But after a while they get bored or restless because, again, there's no connection to how they got there. This idea of waking up one day and saying, well, I'm going to be an abstract artist. That's weird.
You don't believe in that?
I don't believe in that because it flies in the face of the history of art and the history of abstraction. Now, there's a whole separate conversation, Maria, about how all good art is abstract at its core. Right? The arrangement of shape, color, value, what we call the design elements, going all the way back to the cave drawings and beyond.
When art can be really simplified, right? And put into those simple terms.
Yes.
Any kind of art.
Any kind of art. So that's a larger conversation unto itself. How is it that when I look at the paintings by Giotto, for instance, how I can look at those in a grand church and think to myself, they're so contemporary, they're so abstract. The flattening of the shape, the use of color, etc., etc. So there is that. And the ability to even see that and feel that comes with the understanding of one's journey. Now, let's fast forward for a moment on this conversation to the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, and then the mid part of the 20th century, where you do have artists working abstractly. Now,
to this day, forwarding to 21st century.
To 21st century.
Yeah.
So I think, for instance, of Hilma af Klint, who now has become, to art history's knowledge, the first person who was really working abstractly. But she did a lot of drawing from nature before that. Now this is the point I really want to make to our audience out there. That the history of those in the 19th and 20th and now 21st century who do work abstractly, the great ones, let's talk about the great ones, they had a journey that got them there. And I would venture to say...
Even Pollock?
Even Jackson Pollock learned how to draw from observation. One of his teachers was Thomas Hart Benton, who was a figurative painter. So yes, even Jack the Dripper.
Right, because usually people will say, well, he was just dripping paints, never thinking that he drew. He
drew. Franz Klein drew. William de Kooning was a sign painter. He drew beautifully. He was a classical artist. So what am I saying here? Mondrian did beautiful drawings and paintings from observation, and he's a great figure for any artist out there to take a look at the history of how he got to where he got. Pure abstraction with geometry.
Squares,
his studies of trees and how he began to fragment them. The study of cubism, how did they get there? I mean, these are really rich conversations. To ignore this, to ignore this understanding of how these artists ended up working abstractly, what did that journey look like and feel like? That's just ignorance. I'm sorry, I have to use that word. That's just ignorance. I know I get slammed for using that word, but it's true. But when one starts to really look at these artists, any artist, male or female, from any genre, from any country, one begins to see, oh, there's a journey here.
Right. And I have experienced this with Mark in museums because, quite honestly, I don't always understand abstract art, and I will just skip those rooms and be like, well, what is this? A 2-year-old can do this. And then Mark will say, no, but you don't understand the journey, because he knows it and he sees then those rooms and those pieces of very simple abstract art with completely different eyes, and I really appreciate that, and I think it's important. I know I'm not alone in feeling the way I sometimes feel.
Of course, yes, of course. And that's the thing about viewing abstract work. It's tough if someone doesn't have the background of knowledge. It would be true, for instance, of music that's avant-garde. It would be true of dance that's avant-garde. It's kind of beyond the reach or the understanding of the layperson because of the lack of understanding of the history behind it. And this is true in the visual arts. So I know for myself, my journey was one of, as a young student in my teenage years, learning how to draw and paint academically. And I worked that way for some 15 years. Until eventually I started looking at different artists. I started looking, for instance, at the Russian avant-garde artists, Kandinsky, and a host of others. And I began doing these little collages. That's what got me hooked, these little tiny collages. And it kind of went from there. So yes, getting back to when I taught a semester at CCA, I'll give you an example. What I did, one of many exercises I did, I got some big butcher paper, Maria, the white paper, and I just crumpled it but it was a huge amount of butcher paper. And I crumpled it and push pinned it to the wall, and then I lit it. Now you can imagine, lots to investigate there. Mm-hmm. And that was the exercise for the students for actually a couple, 2 or 3 weeks, was to make studies both with drawing and with paint. And they weren't trying to draw and paint the whole thing. They were zeroing in on certain aspects of that folded paper. So what were they seeing and what were they doing? They were seeing shape, light and shadow play. They were seeing forms and volumes that they could literally abstract because it was abstract to begin with.
Right. Well, you also told me a few times how you would also give them the assignment of a glass with the ice cubes in it.
Right. So this is a very simple explanation I use with people. They ask me about abstraction, and I'll bring to the camera. Let's say I'm zooming with them. I'll bring a glass of water with some ice cubes in it, and I'll say, "Can you recognize this?" Well, sure, it's a glass with ice cubes. Then I bring it in very close to the camera, and then it becomes abstract. They're just seeing the shapes of the ice and the water,
or the reflections, or the colors of the stuff
all
around
around
it. Yeah.
So yeah, there are entryways. I think this is part of our conversation. What are those entryways? It could be practically anything. It could be the bark of a tree. You know, we've done this in the language of design. We've done this. So why are we having this conversation? I think we're having it because a lot of artists that I work with are struggling with abstraction. They love the idea, but they feel sometimes lost.
Yes.
And like, what do I do? Where are my ideas coming from? What am I thinking about? Who am I looking at? Or what, more importantly, what am I looking at? And I think that's key. I think that's
it's
why
also
we're doing
what
this.
feeds your expression. And we talked in other videos about the nature of inspiration, for example. But I do believe that any art has to be fed from the outside and from the inside.
Yes.
So what is it that I'm looking at? What is it that how am I living my life, and what am I giving the expression to?
Yes.
Right?
That's well put.
Yeah.
Well put.
And I do want to point out, I mean, even now you will see work behind us, Mark's work, that is abstract, but he still draws from the figure, and he draws from nature. And does that somehow find its way in your work?
Inevitably, it does. It's not a literal connection. It's not even a recognizable connection. But, you know, the arc of a given line might feel like the arc of a thigh muscle. You know, the notion of landscape can be present in abstract work. And I think where some people get confused is when they're looking at something that's very simple, like, let's say, Mark Rothko, where it's just so simple. Well, or the work of Agnes Martin, with just these lines, then it becomes really hard. Because those works, Maria, are much more contemplative. They require almost a spiritual connection, if you will. And that's not always easy. Right. And I understand that.
Right.
Yeah. But again, I think it takes a desire to learn more about how did that artist get there. Even Mark Rothko.
Right. Did he draw?
He did draw. And then he had a whole surrealist phase, which is very different from the work he's known for. So, yes. We keep talking about drawing, don't we? It's part of it. I guess it's hard to escape that.
Right.
Yes. We recently looked at the show of Philip Guston in Washington, D.C. Now, there is a classic example, probably one of the most remarkable examples of the 20th century, of an artist who had a journey.
Right.
Yes.
Figurative to abstract to, I somehow call it like simplified figurative.
Well, cartoons.
Yes.
And cartoons, for him as a young boy, held his fascination.
Right.
So we could talk about these. See, this is interesting. We could talk about these different artists that are famous that we know. of all stripes, and start to think about how they got there. And that to me is endlessly intriguing, exciting, and it's why I look at a lot of work, because I'm just really curious about that journey.
Right. I think that what you're trying to say is that for some artists who just jump straight into abstraction, there could be this point of blockage and not knowing where to go next and how to progress from there, or being stuck in a rut a little bit and just running in circles. So how to get out of there is to bring something new in it. And that could be, well, maybe looking into the world around us and seeing what inspires us. You know, what can we bring into that and maybe start over or open a new vein in a way to explore, right? And there's nothing wrong to go into figurative, even if you want to call yourself an abstract artist.
Sure. In fact, I'm working right now with a few artists online, both in terms of critique but also mentorship. And one artist comes to mind, no names need to be mentioned here. She's a jeweler, and her jewelry is quite beautiful. And there's a connection with the paintings, but the paintings, in my opinion, weren't quite as far along as the jewelry. So we started to talk about that, and in the shapes of some of her jewelry, I had her look at Bryce Martin, the artist, because of how he works with calligraphy, personal calligraphy. Well, he himself looked at Asian calligraphy as a source for inspiration, and he riffed on that. So the point to be made here is it's not just enough to maybe emulate another artist to get some ideas and connections, but then think about, well, where did he or she go?
Come from and go to,
How did they get there? And Joan Mitchell is another great example. I had another artist look at Joan Mitchell, the great abstract expressionist. Well, Joan Mitchell was looking at Monet, late Monet. Why? He was in the garden, she was in the garden. The garden was their connection, you see? So again, this is really worth considering. Where are those connections? How are they happening? And when do they become authentic? That's why we're having this conversation.
Well, that's why we are throwing this seed into the dirt and see what comes out for you. This is, I think, a nice topic to have a conversation. So we welcome your comments, your questions, your thoughts, and then we can film another episode and maybe answer some of those if they come our way.
This is pretty wide and it's pretty deep as a topic.
For sure.
So
let's open the conversation.
Let's open her up.
Thank you for watching.
All right, ciao.